What if the Bible did not tell you the whole story of the beginning? What if before Eve there was another woman, the first wife of Adam, a figure erased from Scripture, yet immortalized in whispers of demons and shadows of myth? Her name was Lilith. She was not created from Adam's rib, but from the same earth, equal in substance and spirit. And when Adam demanded she lie beneath him, she refused. She spoke the forbidden word, the name of God itself, and she fled Eden on wings of midnight. That act of defiance was enough to exile her from the garden, to brand her not as partner, but as monster. From that moment, she was written not as woman, but as threat, not as mother of humanity, but as mother of demons. Yet every erasure leaves a trace. Lilith surfaces in amulets buried beneath doorways, in the Talmud's warnings of infants taken at night, went to Zohar's visions of the Klippath, in the secret languages of witches and mystics. She is the dark mirror of Eve, the unspoken archetype of feminine sovereignty, sexuality unbound, rebellion unashamed. And the fact that her name was struck from holy pages only proves her danger not to humanity, but to the order built on obedience. The question is not whether Lilith existed. The question is why she was silenced. What power does her archetype still hold that makes her story unfit for Scripture? What if the demon you were told to fear was the part of yourself you were told to bury? To understand Lilith, you must first understand the architecture of the story that condemned her. Eden was never simply a garden of innocence. It was a blueprint, a system of hierarchy disguised as paradise. Adam was given dominion over earth and creatures. Eve was fashioned from his rib to ensure companionship and subordination. But before Eve, the texts whisper of another architecture, one where man and woman stood equal, both formed from the same soil. That symmetry was intolerable to the order that would be built, and so Lilith was exiled, her memory erased, her name poisoned. In the alphabet of Ben Sira, she is described as Adam's first wife, refusing to lie beneath him. She claimed equality, invoked the secret name of God, and departed Eden. In rabbinic commentaries, she becomes demon, night hag, stealer of infants. In Mesopotamian lore, she echoes earlier figures, Lelku, Lamishtu, storm spirits of independence and hunger. Each layer adds bricks to the architecture of evil, not because Lilith was evil, but because the system required her to be cast as such. To preserve the hierarchy, rebellion had to be demonized. The architecture extends beyond story into symbol. Lilith was bound to the night, the owl her companion, the serpent her ally. In later medieval texts, she is drawn with long hair, wings, talons. Each image functions as inverted halo, painting sovereignty as monstrosity. Eve, framed as obedient mother, is rewarded with narrative immortality. Lilith, framed as rebellious equal, is banished into shadows. The binary is constructed, and the architecture of patriarchy reinforced, submission sanctified, rebellion demonized. But architecture is never static, it is ritualized. Amulets were inscribed with Adam and Eve, out with Lilith, to ward her away from infants. Mothers whispered charms, binding her in incantations. Every repetition fortified the edifice. Lilith as danger, Eve as virtue. The more she was invoked as demon, the more the system embedded its control. The architecture of evil is this inversion. The one who sought equality becomes archetype of harm, yet cracks remain in the walls. In Kabbalistic texts, Lilith is not erased but woven into the Klippath, the shadow side of divine emanations. She becomes queen of the night, consort of Samael, ruler of husks and shells. In this mirror architecture, Lilith is not merely absence, but presence feared. Yes, but also acknowledged as integral to cosmic balance. Without Lilith, the structure of Kabbalah collapses into sterilized symmetry. With her, it reveals its shadow truth. That repression breeds inversion, and exclusion empowers what is excluded. Consider how architecture in myth mirrors architecture in society. The biblical order insists woman must submit, sexuality must be tamed, independence must be contained. Lilith's refusal is the crack in the foundation, the proof that hierarchy is fragile. To maintain the edifice, her name is buried. But buried stones still bear weight. Her erasure is itself proof of her necessity. The system requires her absence to sustain itself, yet her archetype leaks through every gap. And so Lilith endures, not as saint, but as specter, haunting every structure built on obedience. Every time a woman is silenced, her shadow stirs. Every time desire is shamed, her wings unfurl. Every time autonomy is demonized, her name whispers in the dark. The architecture of Eden was meant to be perfect, seamless. But perfection is brittle. Lilith is the fracture line. The architecture of evil, then, is not Lilith herself. It is the system that required her demonization to stand. It is the scriptural blueprint that cast equality as sin, rebellion as monstrosity, sexuality as corruption. Lilith did not build this prison. She exposed its foundations by refusing to play her part. The evil lies not in her shadow, but in the structure that labeled her shadow evil. This is why her story was erased, not because it lacked significance, but because it revealed too much. To admit Lilith was to admit that obedience was not natural, that hierarchy was not inevitable, that rebellion was always possible, that a system built on silence cannot tolerate reminders of resistance, but architecture once revealed can be dismantled. To study Lilith is to see the scaffolding of control, the stories rewritten, the symbols inverted, the rituals repeated until obedience feels holy. To call her name aloud is to trace the fracture back through time, to feel the weight of erased history pressing against the present. And once you see the pattern, the garden loses its innocence. Eden is no longer paradise, it is prison. And Lilith, the so-called mother of demons, is not its villain, but its first escapee. Every myth survives not only through words, but through symbols, and Lilith is no exception. When her name was erased from scripture, her image became her scripture, carried in carvings, incantations, and whispered fears. To trace her symbols is to read the language of rebellion that survived exile. Each emblem that clings to her all, serpent, hair, wings, is not arbitrary. They are glyphs, each encoding the qualities society sought to suppress. Consider the owl, creature of night. In Mesopotamian seals, Lilith spirits are depicted with talons and owl wings, companions of darkness. The owl sees in shadow, thrives in silence, pierces veils others cannot. In the biblical order, night was danger, light was truth. To pair Lilith with the owl was to declare her sovereign of the forbidden hours, mistress of knowledge concealed. The owl becomes sigil of sight, unblinded by official light, vision uncorrupted by sanctioned truth. The serpent, too, coils around her story. In Eden, the serpent tempts Eve, offering the fruit of knowledge. Lilith, already expelled, becomes linked to the same symbol serpent as archetype of desire, wisdom, rebellion. In patriarchal inversion, serpent equals evil, temptation equals fall. Yet serpent in ancient cults was renewal, shedding, cyclical power. To call Lilith serpentine is to acknowledge her as guardian of transformation, keeper of truths molded by the skin of fear. Hair flowing and unbound is another glyph of Lilith. Medieval texts warned that women should cover their hair, lest Lilith sees the loosened strands as portals. To control hair was to control power, sexuality, wildness, out. But Lilith's hair is always depicted untamed, cascading like dark rivers. In symbolic lexicon, hair is vitality, magnetism, erotic charge. Lilith's free hair is the sigil of uncontained feminine energy, the very force the system worked to bind beneath veils. And then there are her wings spread wide, feathered in night. Unlike Eve, rooted to garden and husband, Lilith takes flight. Wings mark her as liminal being, refusing Earth's imposed boundaries. To fly is to reject domestication, to claim vertical sovereignty. In medieval amulets, she is shown winged taloned, perched above sleeping men or infants. The image is meant to frighten, yet inverted, it is a declaration. Here is the woman who will not crawl, who will not kneel, who will not stay earthbound. These symbols, repeated in art and magic, form a shadow alphabet. They speak to those who know how to read. Owl says, I see what others do not. Serpent says, I hold wisdom you fear. Hair says, I refuse your veil. Wings say, I will not be contained. Together they create a glyph of rebellion, a sigil of sovereignty disguised as demonology. Contrast this with Eve's symbols. Eve is rib, garden, fruit, submission. Her hair is covered, her body clothed, her role maternal. She embodies obedience and consequence. Her symbols reinforce order. Fruit becomes sin, motherhood becomes penalty, covering becomes virtue. Lilith's symbols, by contrast, are inversion of that code. Where Eve submits, Lilith defies. Where Eve nurtures within boundaries, Lilith devours boundaries themselves. Where Eve's fruit binds to mortality, Lilith's serpent whispers immortality. The system needed these binaries. Eve's sanctified obedience, Lilith demonized rebellion. But the symbols tell another story. They preserve Lilith not as absence but as presence, encoded in fear. Each talisman inscribed "Begone, Lilith" is proof of her endurance. Each charm against her is acknowledgement of her power. Every symbol used to banish her is also invocation, keeping her archetype alive through centuries of erasure. In Kabbalah, her symbols deepen. She becomes associated with the moon's dark side, with Gevurah inverted into Klippath, with shells that conceal divinity. Her sigils appear in grimoires as spirals, as circles of names repeated to constrain her. Yet in secret traditions, witches and mystics invoked those very names not to repel but to summon. To inscribe Lilith's sigil was to call sovereignty into the circle, to invite the unbound feminine as ally rather than adversary. Even in modern culture, her symbols endure. The owl recurs in occult art, the serpent in feminist reclamations, the unbound hair in witchcraft imagery, the wings in dark archetypal portraits. Each resurgence proves the same truth. Symbols cannot be erased. Migrate, adapt, whisper their meaning across centuries. The language of symbols is the language of survival. Lilith may have been struck from scripture, but her glyphs remain etched in collective memory. They function as hidden script, teaching that what is demonized often carries hidden wisdom. To see an owl at night, to dream of serpents, to feel your hair stir in forbidden wind, these are not accidents. They are echoes of an archetype that refuses to die. And every suppressed symbol is a truth inverted. The owl is not evil, it is vision. The serpent is not sin, it is transformation. The hair is not shame, it is vitality. The wings are not monstrosity, they are freedom. Decode the symbols, and Lilith is revealed not as demoness, but as the first whisper of sovereignty denied. Blood has always been the most primal contract, the one currency no god, no demon, no system can counterfeit. And in the story of Lilith, blood is both accusation and testimony. From the earliest fragments, Lilith is not only cast as Adam's rebellious equal, but also as predator of infants, drinker of maternal essence, a shadow that hovers at the threshold of birth and death. It is no accident. The architects of Scripture understood that to demonize Lilith most effectively, she had to be tied to blood, the very substance of life and lineage. In the alphabet of Ben Sera, Lilith flees Eden and swears vengeance on Adam's children. In Jewish amulets buried in cradles, her name is carved alongside protective angels, as if to say, "Guard the child, for Lilith comes by night." Mothers were warned to keep vigil, for the mother of demons feeds on newborn blood. But here lies the inversion. Lilith does not actually appear as devourer until the system needs her to embody the cost of rebellion. By painting her hunger in blood, the scribes ensured fear of her outlived her story. Blood is not merely physical. It is symbolic of inheritance, of fertility, of cycles. Eve is sanctified as mother, whose blood becomes lineage, sacred through obedience. Lilith, by contrast, is vilified as a destroyer, whose blood is cursed, whose touch is lethal. This binary reinforced the order. Woman who bleeds for family is holy. Woman who bleeds for herself is demonic. The same blood, inverted into opposite meanings. But look deeper, and you find another truth. Lilith is linked to childbirth, not only as threat, but as an archetype of untamed power. In ancient Mesopotamian incantations, figures like Lamashtu and Lilcu stalked the birthing bed. Why? Because birth is the most liminal moment, when flesh opens, blood flows, and the boundary between worlds thins. To demonize Lilith as predator of the birthing chamber was to deny women ownership of their own liminality, to terrify them into submission, yet the very terror reveals her potency. Lilith was recognized even by those who feared her as sovereign over thresholds, guardian of blood's passage between worlds. Blood also carries the mark of sexuality. In patriarchal codes, a woman's blood, her menses, was impurity, exile, taboo. Yet for Lilith, blood was not curse but crown. Her sexuality was unbound, her desire unshamed, her blood flowing without permission from husband or priest. This independence could not be tolerated. So her blood was rewritten as monstrous, her desire as predatory. The narrative became warning. Embrace Lilith's path, and your blood will curse you. Deny it, and your blood will sanctify you. Every sacrifice is sealed in blood. Lilith's sacrifice was refusal. She bled not for Adam, not for Yahweh, not for lineage, but for herself. She sacrificed paradise to preserve sovereignty. And in Demonology, this sacrifice is rebranded as curse. The blood of children, the blood of mothers, the blood of fear-all projected onto her name. Yet in truth, what bleeds through Lilith is the recognition that rebellion has a cost, and that cost is always paid in essence, in vitality, in blood. Consider the talismans inscribed to ward her off. Each one is a silent admission that her archetype could not be erased. Each drop of blood painted on lintel or altar to keep her away was ironically an offering to her. Fear itself became sacrifice, flowing as psychic blood into her shadow. In trying to suppress her, the system continued to feed her, generation after generation. In Kabbalah, Lilith joined Samael as Queen of the Night. Their union is said to produce demon children, an endless lineage of husks. But seen symbolically, this lineage is not monstrosity. It is all the suppressed desires, unspoken angers, hidden lusts of humanity, children of blood denied. The architecture of Eden demanded sterile obedience. Lilith's bloodline reminds us that repression only multiplies what is denied. In modern reclamations, witches call on Lilith not as predator, but as liberator. They see her blood not as curse, but as sacrifice of obedience. Menstrual blood becomes offering, childbirth becomes empowerment. Sexual blood becomes packed with sovereignty rather than penalty. In these circles, blood flows again for Lilith, but this time consciously, chosen, reclaimed. The oldest currency becomes currency of freedom. And this is the forbidden truth. Blood is always exchanged. Either it is drained by systems of control wars, childbirth shrouded in fear, sexuality wrapped in shame, or it is offered deliberately, claimed as ritual of awakening.
Lilith embodies the refusal to bleed unconsciously.
She bleeds in exile, but her blood is hers, and that is why she terrified the architects of Eden. Blood as the oldest currency reveals the fracture between Eve and Lilith. Eve's blood sanctifies hierarchy. Blood sanctifies rebellion. The former is canonized, the latter demonized. But in the dark corridors of myth, the latter persists. Because every drop of blood spilled in silence, every wound of repression, every hidden scream, these belong to Lilith, mother of demons, mother of shadows, mother of sovereignty, denied. To invoke her is to admit rebellion costs, sovereignty bleeds. But better to bleed for yourself than to bleed for a cage. This is Lilith's lesson written in the oldest currency humanity has ever known. Every myth of power is also a myth of contract. From Faust, who bartered with Mephistopheles, to kings who swore covenants with gods, to the magician who drew sigils in ash and signed with blood, the underlying law is always the same. Nothing is given without an agreement. Yet Lilith stands apart, because her entire legend begins not with an oath accepted, but with a contract refused. Adam and Lilith were shaped from the same clay. They shared essence, equal in form and breath. But when Adam demanded hierarchy, when he insisted that she lie beneath, Lilith did not consent. She invoked the ineffable name of God, a word too holy for mortal lips, and she fled Eden. That utterance was not simply rebellion, it was the severing of a pact. By pronouncing the unutterable, Lilith voided the silent contract binding her to subordination. In that moment, she enacted the first self-contract, the vow to herself that no power, divine or human, would dictate her position. This refusal is what turned her into a demon in the eyes of the system. Because every architecture of control relies on silent agreements, obedience given without words. submission accepted without question. Eve enters this covenant. She is shaped from Adam's rib, her role defined, her obedience expected. Lilith, by refusing, shatters the model. And for that she must be rewritten not as sovereign, but as threat. The myth declares, she made no pact with Adam, therefore she must have made pact with demons. The absence of contract with man is rebranded as alliance with monsters. But in truth, Lilith's pact was with herself. In Kabbalistic lore, she later unites with Samael, archangel of severity, ruler of husks. Their marriage is described as covenant of shadows, birthing endless demons. Yet symbolically, this union is the continuation of her self-contract. Samael is not partner as Adam was. He is mirror, a reflection of her refusal to kneel. Together they represent the archetype of sovereignty, joined with rebellion, an eternal contract outside divine law. The motif of pacts clings to her across centuries. Medieval amulets, inscribed with angelic names, were used to banish her, as if to declare a contract against her. Yet every binding spell is itself an acknowledgement of her contractual power. To ward her is to admit her capacity to negotiate with souls. Witches, on the other hand, called her name in secret rites, not to bind her, but to ally. To summon Lilith was to sign another kind of contract, a vow of independence, of sexuality unshamed, of desire claimed. Where the priests inscribed oaths of exclusion, the witches carved oaths of inclusion. Both revealed the same truth. Lilith was always about covenant, about the danger and power of where one's allegiance is placed. In modern readings, Lilith becomes an archetype of every pact broken against oppression. To leave a marriage not chosen, to abandon traditions that suffocate, to speak forbidden truths, these are Lilith's contracts renewed. They are not bargains with demons, but self-vows written in defiance. In each act of self-ownership echoes her first departure from Eden, the refusal to sign her name to a covenant of silence. The system, of course, could not allow such an archetype to stand unchallenged, so Lilith's refusal was recast as curse. Instead of celebrating her self-contract, myths declared she signed pact with death itself, vowing to steal children, to seduce men, to spill blood. This is the classic inversion. Sovereignty becomes danger, refusal becomes harm, independence becomes destruction. The false story insists, if you do not bind yourself to the righteous order, you will inevitably bind yourself to evil. Yet this binary is a cage, and Lilith's existence proves it false. She shows a third path. Not contract with Adam, not contract with Yahweh, not contract with archons, contract with self. In esoteric terms, this is the forbidden pact. To swear to your own sovereignty is to step outside the circuitry of ritualized obedience. 'Tis to become untraceable in the astral economy, unharvestable by systems of fear. The magician who dares to invoke Lilith is not simply calling a demoness, but activating this archetype within, signing with their own essence that their blood, their desire, their power belongs to them alone. Imagine Lilith's departure. Adam stands in Eden, demanding. The angels rise to chase her, demanding she return. She speaks the secret name, wings unfurl, and she leaves. That moment is the ritual of pacts in its purest form. Not a deal struck with another, but a vow carved into one's own being. I will not sign what cages me. That vow still reverberates through every shadow of history. The lesson of Lilith is not that all pacts enslave. Pact defines your allegiance. Sign unconsciously and you become servant. Refuse and you risk exile. Sign with yourself and you step into sovereignty, though the world may brand you demon for it. This is why Lilith endures not as monster, but as a reminder that the most forbidden contract is the one you keep with your own soul. In the myths of Eden, morality is not born, it is engineered.
Good and evil are not eternal truths, but categories shaped to preserve hierarchy. Eve is sanctified as good because she obeys the architecture of submission. Lilith is condemned as evil because she rejects it. This is the inverted moral code. Obedience renamed as virtue, rebellion rewritten as sin, sovereignty demonized as monstrosity.
Consider Eve's narrative. She is crafted from Adam's rib, a derivative life, framed as helper, consort, mother. When she eats the fruit, she is punished, but her punishment reinforces obedience. She accepts her role as bearer of children, her pain sanctified as divine will. In the story's logic, Eve redeems her disobedience by embracing suffering, by accepting her place in the structure. Thus, she is preserved as mother of all living. Her obedience to order is rewarded with narrative survival.
Now contrast Lilith.
She is not derivative, but equal. Made of the same earth as Adam, she refuses subordination, asserts equality, invokes the secret name of God. For this act, she is not punished with labor or pain. She is erased.
As
She becomes absent in canon, present only as demon. In rabbinic lore, she becomes a seductress of men, strangler of infants, enemy of domestic peace. Her refusal to obey is rebranded as predation. Where Eve is remembered as nurturer, Lilith is remembered as destroyer. This is inversion in its purest form. The qualities of independence, desire and equality are demonized, while their opposites are sanctified. The inverted code extends into symbol. Eve's covered hair, her modesty, her garden-bound role, these become visual shorthand for goodness. Lilith's unbound hair, her naked flight, her nocturnal companions, these are marked as monstrous. Where in art and amulets, Eve is crowned with children. Lilith is shown with talons and wings. Both images encode the same polarity: obedience rewarded, rebellion punished. Yet the architecture of this moral code reveals itself when examined. Why should equality be evil? Why should refusal to lie beneath Adam be monstrous? Why should invoking the name of God be curse instead of prayer? The answers are not divine, they are political. By labeling Lilith's sovereignty as evil, the system ensures women who emulate her will be feared and suppressed. By sanctifying Eve's obedience, the system rewards compliance with the promise of sanctity. Morality is inverted to preserve control. This inversion seeps into ritual. In childbirth, prayers are offered against Lilith, as if independence itself is threat to infants. In sexuality, desire is painted as dangerous. Lilith as succubus, who drains men in their sleep. In every case, natural human powers, lust, autonomy, equality are rebranded as demonic. Meanwhile, silence, submission, and pain are uplifted as holy virtues. The very experiences that could liberate are coded as sin. The very conditions that enslave are framed as righteousness. The inverted code thrives because it masquerades as eternal truth. It tells generations of women that their sovereignty is dangerous, their voice a curse, their sexuality a demon. It tells generations of men that desire is weakness, that independence in women is threat, that obedience is the only path to security. Through this inversion, Lilith becomes the scapegoat for everything suppressed. Every hunger denied, every rage buried, every shadow unacknowledged, these are projected onto her name. She becomes mother of demons because the system cannot admit it birthed demons itself. But beneath the surface, the inversion reveals the truth. The so-called evil qualities of Lilith, her refusal to kneel, her embrace of desire, her ownership of voicer, the very traits of sovereignty. What is demonized is precisely what threatens the system of control. What is praised in obedience, silence, self-sacrifice are the traits that sustain hierarchy. The moral code is not moral at all. It is propaganda. Kabbalistic writings preserve this tension. Lilith is described as the other Eve, the night to her day, the shadow of the divine feminine. But even as they demonize her, they acknowledge her necessity. Without Lilith, Eve has no mirror. Without shadow, light collapses. The code must invert her, but it cannot erase her entirely, for balance demands her presence. Thus she endures, lurking in margins, whispered in fears, hidden in symbols, waiting to be reclaimed. Imagine Eve and Lilith standing side by side. One crowned as mother, one cursed as demon. One framed as virtue, one condemned as sin. Yet strip away the labels and you see, they are two archetypes of the same force. Eve is the version domesticated. Lilith is the version unbound. The inversion is not about truth, but about control. By casting one as good and the other as evil, the system divides what should have been whole. The inverted moral code is the true prison. It ensures that every time you feel desire, you hear whispers of sin. Every time you seek equality, you feel the weight of curse. Every time you embrace your own voice, you fear the label of rebellion. These reflexes are not divine, they are programming. They are the architecture of Eden still whispering through culture. To awaken is to flip the inversion, to see that Lilith's so-called sins are sovereignty, that Eve's so-called virtues are chains. To recognize that morality is not cosmic truth, but political invention. To reclaim what was demonized and to question what was sanctified. Only then does the prison tremble. Only then does Lilith's exile end. Ritual is never confined to temples, seeps into homes, into lullabies, into the smallest gestures repeated across centuries. If Lilith is the archetype of rebellion, then every culture has developed rituals to contain her, to name her, to drive her away. And yet in driving her away, they continually invoke her, keeping her presence alive in the very fabric of daily life. Rituals everywhere carry Lilith's shadow, even when they claim to banish it. Consider the protective amulets buried beneath thresholds in medieval Jewish households. They were inscribed with the names of 3 angels, Sans, Noi, and Samangeloff said to have pursued Lilith after she fled Eden. Mothers drew these names on nursery walls, whispered them over cradles, tied red strings around their children's wrists. The act was meant to repel her. But each invocation was also acknowledgement. Lilith is near. Lilith is powerful. Lilith must be named. The banishing ritual kept her archetype alive, repeated endlessly across generations. Birth itself became a battlefield of ritual. The liminal moment of a woman laboring, blood flowing, child emerging was considered her domain. To ward her off, families lit lamps through the night, chanted prayers, performed rites of protection. In Mesopotamia, incantation bowls inscribed with spiraling text trapped Lilith-like figures within their circles. These bowls, buried upside down beneath houses, were both magical tools and daily household objects. Imagine the paradox. To live with safety, one had to surround oneself with Lilith's image. The ritual of exclusion was also a ritual of invocation. Sexuality bore her mark. Men fearing nocturnal emissions would recite prayers, fearing Lilith as succubus. Wives were warned to cover their hair, lest Lilith seize their loosened strands. Entire codes of modesty grew around this anxiety-ritualized concealment to prevent Lilith's touch. Thus, every veil drawn, every hair bound became a silent exorcism. Yet the very need for ritual restraint proves her symbolic dominance. In Kabbalistic circles, Lilith was woven into cosmology through ritual texts. She was consort of Samiel, queen of the Kliphoth, invoked in secret exorcisms. Prayers against her were highly detailed, binding her name in chains of divine words. Yet mystics also hinted at her power, some even calling upon her in forbidden rites, seeking her strength rather than her banishment. In both cases, she was present. Whether feared or revered, Lilith was always ritualized. And ritual did not stop in the medieval world. In modern occultism, witches reclaim her name, chanting it as invocation of feminine power. Circles are drawn, candles lit, blood offered, and her archetype is summoned not as predator, but as ally. What was once whispered as curse becomes spell of liberation. Lilith has become central to feminist ritual, embodying the refusal to obey, the reclamation of desire, the unshackling of shadow. Even outside magic, culture performs rituals around her. The Lilith Fair Music Festival reclaimed her as an icon of female creativity. In astrology, the Black Moon Lilith is invoked in charts as point of desire, rage, and sovereignty. Films and literature use her name as shorthand for dangerous feminine allure. Every appearance is a ritual reenactment, a summoning of archetype through art. Society may have once tried to bury her, but its stories, songs, and symbols resurrect her continually. Yet the most subtle rituals are unconscious. Each time a child is told to behave, each time a woman is told to be modest, each time desire is labeled sinful, the ritual of Lilith's exile repeats. The system still acts out the ancient drama. Eve rewarded, Lilith cast out. Patriarchal structures ensure obedience through small, daily liturgies of shame. The code lives not only in churches, but in classrooms, workplaces, media. Lilith is exercised every day, not with bowls and amulets, but with rules and expectations. But the inversion persists, for in every ritual of suppression her shadow stirs. To cover hair is to remember it unbound. To name Lilith as danger is to affirm her existence. To perform protection is to concede her power. Thus, even in rejection, she is ritualized. She cannot be erased, only exiled. And exile is never absolute. This is the forbidden truth of ritual. To expel is also to summon. Every charm against Lilith, every story demonizing her, every sermon warning of her lust is energy directed toward her archetype. Fear itself is offering. Repetition is invocation. The system that tried to destroy her inadvertently immortalized her. Lilith thrives in ritual because ritual is repetition, and repetition is survival. Imagine the mother tying red thread on her child's wrist. She whispers names of angels, but behind the act, Lilith listens. Imagine the priest warning of demons in hair unbound, yet in every warning, Lilith's wings beat stronger. Imagine the witch invoking her name in a midnight circle, aware that the same syllables once spoken to, banished, now summoned. Ritual is everywhere, and through ritual, Lilith has never left. The truth is this: the system ritualized her exile, but in doing so, it ritualized her memory. Lilith lives wherever ritual repeats, whether to fear her or to embrace her. The question is not whether you will call her name, you already do, in whispers of culture and patterns of fear. The question is, will you call her in chains or in freedom? To awaken to Lilith is to awaken to the mechanics of erasure itself. She is not merely a figure of myth, nor only a demon whispered about in the margins of sacred texts. She is the mirror, and what you see reflected in her is not some external monster, but the part of yourself you were told to disown. The system that exiled her from Eden still lives today, not as a garden, but as the daily rituals of obedience that keep the soul caged. To see Lilith clearly is to see the system. Her exile is not just a story about a woman refusing to lie beneath Adam. It is the blueprint of how power rewrites rebellion into sin. Eve is remembered because she obeyed after she erred. Lilith is erased because she refused to kneel at all. In awakening to this contrast, you begin to see how every moral code handed down is not eternal law, but selective narrative, designed to reward compliance and punish autonomy. Lilith shows you the hidden gears of the machine. Awakening means reclaiming what was demonized. Her unbound hair, her sexuality, her voice, all the qualities condemned as dangerous are the very energies necessary for sovereignty. They told you to cover your hair, to silence your desire, to fear your independence, because those were the gateways through which Lilith lived in you. To awaken is to stop apologizing for these traits, to recognize them as sources of power rather than sin. Lilith does not grant permission. She reveals that permission was never needed. This recognition shakes the architecture. The inverted moral code only functions as long as you believe obedience is holy. Once you see that virtue has been constructed to benefit hierarchy, its spell collapses. Lilith becomes the whisper of resistance that was always inside you, reminding you that sovereignty requires no validation. When you awaken, you no longer ask, "Am I good?" but rather, "Whose good am I serving?" The question itself unravels the system. Awakening to Lilith also exposes how ritual has been used against you. Every amulet to ward her off, every sermon warning of her lust, every modesty code, every fearful story about demons, these were not divine protections but mechanisms of programming. They ritualized her exile to keep you obedient, and yet paradoxically, they kept her alive. Every repetition of her name and fear was still an invocation. She survived because the system could not stop speaking of her. In awakening, you realize that what they feared in Lilith was never destruction, it was memory. The memory of choice, of refusal, of equality unbound. But awakening is not simple liberation. It comes with cost. To invoke Lilith is to confront your shadow, the rage, the lust, the grief buried under centuries of shame. To reclaim her archetype is to bleed consciously, to feel the price of exile, and still choose it. This is why her story resonates in the modern psyche. She is not comfort, she is confrontation. And yet in facing her, you reclaim the fragments of self stolen by obedience. Lilith as archetype shows that freedom is not gifted, is seized. She fled Eden alone, wings cutting through night, no choir of angels guiding her, no promise of reward. Awakening means stepping into the same loneliness, the same wilderness, refusing the false light of acceptance. It means becoming her mirror, willing to be called demon rather than slave, willing to be erased rather than controlled. This is not easy, and it is why the system still warns against her. but the fear is the proof. In psychological terms, Lilith is the repressed shadow. In mystical terms, she is the sovereign feminine. In mythic terms, she is the crack in Eden. However you name her, the awakening she brings is the same. The realization that what you were taught to fear is often what you need most. The qualities you bury become the chains that bind you. Qualities you reclaim become the keys that free you. Lilith is both chain and key, depending on whether you see her through the system's lens or your own. To awaken to the system is to stop seeing Lilith as an external demon and start seeing her as inner mirror. She is the archetype that reveals how power inverts morality, how ritual sustains suppression, how fear sustains obedience. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. The rituals of silence lose their grip. The amulets against desire lose their spell. The exile ends, not because Lilith returns to Eden, but because Eden itself is revealed as cage. The forbidden truth is that you were Lilith all along. Every time you felt desire and swallowed it, every time you wanted to speak and silenced yourself, every time you longed for equality and were told it was arrogance, you lived her story. Awakening is not about summoning an ancient demoness. It is about recognizing that the first wife of Adam, erased and demonized, still breathes in you. To embrace her is to embrace yourself, whole light and dark, obedient and rebellious, nurturing and sovereign. And that is the secret the system feared most, that once you remember Lilith, you remember your own power. Once you awaken to her, you awaken to the system. And once awakened, you can never again be contained. Her name was struck from scripture, yet her shadow never faded. Lilith lingers in every silence, in every forbidden desire, in every rebellion whispered beneath the weight of order. Will you exile her again, or let her rise within you? Comment, subscribe, and step into the forbidden.